So this is about the what. Now the how. So you have now identified what motivates you. Why did you come up with this, solution? What is it solving? Then you identified activities. Now it's very important to explain how are you going to make it happen. This is typically the less exciting part of the proposal, so it's not about ideas. This is about implementation. So the timelines. What is a very good down is to break down the proposal into some key activities, and then plugging them into a Gantt chart. This is wonderful. If you can produce a Gantt chart in a proposal, if I was looking at proposals and I see a Gantt chart, chances are very high it's already a serious proposal, that people have thought about the time sequencing of their activities. Another important part of the how is the team composition. Who is your team? And especially in e-democracy projects, we are an EGAP program, and we are working with EGAP Challenge. EGAP Challenge is one of our instruments to provide financing for startups on e-democracy. And one thing that we see is that the most, let's say, successful solutions that make it through to the let's say, selection rounds, and then are sustainable during incubation, are the ones that have a very good team. Multidisciplinary, and particularly with technological solutions, the more multidisciplinary team can be, the better for you. So in hackathons, if you have a graphic designer, then you have a political scientist or social scientist, obviously the programmer, software developer, and this team is very important to combine tech plus something. This team composition should be, again, clearly outlined in your proposal. Then it's a question of budget. How are you wanting to distribute resources in the different activities, which is going to be very important. For example, immediately when we look at proposals, you look at heavy activities that are linked to financing, and you go, let's say, with a magnifying glass on those. So budget is very indicative of how the project, what are the deliverables and how the project will function, where you will get the most benefit. So be also very careful, how do you attribute financial, let's say, resources or expected resources to the activities that you do. They have to make sense. You cannot create a program that is, let's say, going to train, the focus is to implement a solution for, let's say, people with 50 plus, sort of older generation people. Let's say you're creating an application that is going to teach them how to use a particular e-service better. Now, if most of your budget is going to be only in tech, and you're not going to have money in training, for me it's already screaming alarm bells that is not going to be sustainable. When you're having a 50 plus, let's say, target group, a demographic target group, you have to think about the design, including budget, that training is probably going to be playing a large part of the role. Testing is going to be playing quite an important role. So, don't think of budget as a very mechanical activity. That the composition of the budget has to make sense with your overall design. So the last part is also how will you measure results? This is also something that projects tend to neglect. It's the indicators. How are you going to ensure that the objectives you have set out and the activities are actually measurable? But one very important rule of thumb, how to set up a monitoring and indicators for impact, if you will, and activities, is that the indicators should be smart. They should be specific, they should be measurable, they should be achievable, responsible, and they have to be time-bound. In other words, they have to be time-related. It's very important to build into your project design is how will you actually monitor these results. And one other important thing, this is kind of a bonus hint, and donors particularly like it, and I would imagine also private sector, if you're going to be submitting proposals for the private sector, is to provide some risks. We know that all projects, doesn't matter how amazing they are, there will be some risks of the proposed solutions. Risks and sometimes things that may or may not work out. Because especially the more we plug in things into practice and into social processes, especially tech in social processes, there's a lot of different micro steps that can swerve the results in different direction. So it's very okay. And, many times we see that people tend to omit because they're scared to admit that there are risks in their solutions and in their projects, but it's completely normal. And for a donor, it's very important to know at the beginning, because still at the beginning, you could start to create risk mitigation measures into the project, and you can potentially do it together with donor, and you should provide those solutions. But how can you overcome the risk? It's much easier to do at the beginning than if you brush them under the carpet. You implement projects and they pop up. They pop up. And they do pop up. I have implemented quite a few projects myself, and there were things that were unexpected. And it's good to think, however, when you're designing a project, what could go wrong, and communicate that. Because once again, one can then build in risk mitigation measures and solutions, how to go about that. So please add a section. This is definitely a favorable, that will be favorable for your proposal, is some identified risks. And how do you think you can overcome them? This will definitely score you points. I can guarantee you that. Now, common mistakes. I will go over that quite fast as we're running out of time. Typically for e-democracy projects, too much technology, and not enough process, not enough human dimension, and maybe not even adequately focus on users. Again, going back to the point, who are your users? How are you thinking about your users? Are you thinking that they're automatic? We see particularly, for example, in Ukraine, that many of the solutions, even if they are launched, they're not necessarily used, or they're used suboptimally. So what are you going to do about that? Knowing this is a trend in Ukraine, again, I would expect, if I was a donor in Ukraine, looking at e-democracy projects, knowing this is a problem, how will this project communicate that there's an issue with users? So I would expect there is some add-on marketing activities, attracting, thinking about users, maybe capacity building, use of civil society organizations, universities, media, to beef up, the public awareness. So, this is a common mistake with also, it's called in, let's say, research lingo, we will build them, they will come. We will build technology and a priori people will come. This doesn't happen. So please avoid this mistake and think about how you can overcome it. The next typical thing is no pre-testing. I have seen tons of proposals that are saying, we're going to make the state-of-the-art, we're starting from scratch, we're making state-of-the-art solution, but I'm going, that's very nice on paper. I know that in reality, tech solutions, even they're fantastically designed, they encounter issues. Various issues, technical issues, behavioral issues, human take-up, and so on. If you don't show me there is a pre-testing, for me this is already an implementation risk. That I as a donor will think about, okay, they didn't think about that. They think they can fly with this. So, and also the minimal MVP. So you need typically a minimum viable product to propose within a project. That would be an ideal starting point, and then how you're going to test it and introduce it. So do think about the testing aspect very strongly within e-democracy projects. Third thing is online, offline. I already mentioned it. Please do think about the relationship. The strongest projects, most successful projects are those that marry the two. Fourth thing that there's typically in e-democracy project that people don't build in is lack of training. And lack of training built into solutions, or maybe massage, I call it massaging, behavioral massaging. And this can already show you in testing stage. So that's why testing is so important, potentially whether the assumptions you are making in your design of your solution are actually true. And if you pre-test it, they're going to pop up. Then you can start to design maybe capacity building packages, to make sure that that doesn't happen, or that you actually mitigate that potential risk. The last thing I would say, marketing. I would always give this hint. I mentioned it in the previous, that many times people they assume that simply if they will launch a project, people will come and use it, and there'll be huge traffic, it'll be super successful immediately. We know that that's rare. So therefore, I say many times to startups, treat an e-democracy project almost as a private sector project or business project. So create a business model, and part of the business model, marketing is huge. How are you going to advertise it? How will public know that your solution exists? But what about different target groups? How about the elderly? How about the youth? How about government? Also, government many times requires a very particular marketing than does an elderly person or youth. So this needs to be thought about, and it's a common mistake that many of the e-democracy projects don't do. Now, lastly, it's about options for fundraising. There's a lot. I don't have a huge list as to, give you a recipe or a list of all the institutions that are there. Clearly, donors in Ukraine are one avenue, and there are quite several of them that are working in the e-governance sector. Government is another. I know that government currently in Ukraine, there is still not sufficient, resource allocation because there are so many priorities. But we are certainly working, and I encourage all of you to, within your, be it at a city level, to do and go ask your government representatives, do push them to start allocating resources or pooling resources. One of the most, creative, funding option is creating match and fund. It means that if you have a project, you can almost guarantee that if you come with a cold call, it means if you come outside of the program cycle, with a project proposal to somebody and say, hey, we have a fantastic idea, fund it. Chances are, first reaction is going to be, first tell me about it, and then, we don't have money, not now, maybe next year. This is typical. If people come up with that, you need to come with the next step. This is a classic sales job. You don't have to fund everything. You can fund one portion, and then we will go to the, government. Government will typically not have money. This is going to be classic. We don't have all of it, or we don't have any of it. So how about if you fund half of it, maybe training, and we will find the rest of the money in private sector. Typically, people are very open to, or are more open to match and fund, so combined funding option, because it means they don't have to front up all the money. This is something that projects tend to neglect and forget. So I would encourage you to be very clever as to go, obviously, to the direct, government, donors. Also, crowdfunding, obviously, is a very big, depending on your project. Crowdfunding platforms are very particular. They tend to fund heavy social impact projects that are easy sells. So you may want to think, where do you spend your energy pitching your project? Also, for donors, it's very labor intensive to work with different applications, to go through the process. So do think about your energy and resources that you have at your disposal. How you're going to go and what do you how do you approach to your whole fundraising strategy. But many times there are a lot of opportunities, and maybe when you are already starting to design projects, I would even as part of your thinking design process, think about a fundraising strategy immediately. Don't go one, then the next. Put a whole list of potential and go knocking on doors. Obviously, when there are proposals, formal proposals from donors, then answer those. But do a very, I would say, multi-track fundraising strategy. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I will end it at there. Thank you.